Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Greetings again to all of our loyal Hydrogen Rising listeners out there. I'm David Wochner, a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of K&L Gates and co-leader of our firm's global hydrogen practice. Just want to start on a personal note, I guess, today for Hydrogen Rising. Our regular listeners, of course, will remember my longtime co-host, Sandi Safro. And you'll remember at the beginning of August, we told you that Sandi would be leaving K&L and joining the Edison Electric Institute as Senior Regulatory Counsel, focused on energy transition matters, including hydrogen. And so I am very excited today to welcome Sandi back to our recording studio to join me as co-host again for Hydrogen Rising. I'm very confident that her experience and her expertise now working with EEI will bring a great new perspective to the podcast each week. So Sandi, welcome back. How are things going for you?
Hey, David. Thank you so much. It's been about a month since I've been at EEI. I think I'm actually starting my fourth week as we're recording this episode today. And I have been working over the last couple of weeks on some really interesting electric transmission issues, which folks who are familiar will know is one of the components to getting more diverse energy sources onto the grid. And mixed in there, of course, could be power generated from hydrogen in the near future. I've also got a couple of hydrogen projects that I am working on and will be working on over the next few months, and I'm looking forward to being able to share more on that when I can. But it is great to be back in our virtual studio with you, and I'm looking forward to digging in on our episode today.
That's great, and certainly excited to dive in deep with EEI soon in one of our upcoming podcasts and their role in the hydrogen economy. But for today, really pleased that we're going to be launching a multi-episode discussion of hydrogen and the maritime industry. As all of our listeners will be aware, the global maritime transportation industry is a significant contributor to worldwide emissions, and the industry has been actively engaged in exploring ways to reduce that emissions profile, really both through the industry's own efforts, but also through international treaties and legal obligations that now exist in the international framework. So to kick off our discussion in this multi-episode segment, we're very excited to be joined by my K&L Gates partner, Reid. Luke is based in our Boston office and practices almost exclusively in the maritime sector. He is a former U.S. Coast Guard officer, having left active duty as a commander in 2011. While on active duty in the U.S. Coast Guard, Luke served in a variety of operational and legal assignments. Now here at K&L Gates, Luke advises and represents corporations and individuals in major marine casualty accidents and investigations, related civil and criminal litigation as well. And a large part of his practice also involves advising ship owners and operators on all aspects of compliance with international and domestic regulations in the maritime space. So I think a really great kickoff here. So Luke, we have a very educated audience when it comes to hydrogen, but I expect that a lot of our listeners are quite honestly landlubbers like me and probably don't know that much about the maritime industry. Since you spend your days working with the industry in this sector, can you lay a foundation for us? Maybe kind of tell us a bit about the industry, help orient our listeners how it operates, and I think importantly, kind of the current high-level perspective of the industry on the need to transition fuels and the need to transition into emissions-reducing technologies.
Absolutely. David, Sandi, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here. So the domestic and international maritime industry is really essential to the health and resiliency of sort of our overall economy globally. It's probably one of the least understood industries within our society. Roughly 80 to 90% of the world trade is carried by vessel. So one way to think about this is to sort of look around your home or office. The vast majority of everything around you was very likely transported by ship at some point in the supply chain. And it's not just manufactured products. Vessels transport every commodity that you can think of, which fuels other parts of our economy. Oil, natural gas, iron ore, soybeans, concrete. The list really goes on and on. And of course, our maritime ports in the United States and around the globe also play a crucial role. They provide an interconnection with other forms of transport like rail and truck to eventually bring these products to market. Very clearly, the maritime industry is a crucial, I would say indispensable, component of our domestic and global economy. So historically, shipping by vessels has been widely regarded as being viewed as the most efficient ways to transport goods and with the smallest environmental footprint overall. With that said, as with all industries, the maritime industry and governments around the world really are acknowledging that there's a great deal of work to be done in regard to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions within the maritime sector. The International Maritime Organization, just to give you sort of a high-level view, the International Maritime Organization is a UN body that is essentially tasked with developing global regulations for shipping, including in the area of the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, policymakers in the U.S. Also regulate the maritime industry, both domestically and foreign flag vessels coming to the United States. They have clearly signaled an intent to decarbonize not only the international shipping sector, but also the U.S. domestic maritime sector as well. So with that high-level overview, the alternative fuels that we're talking about, specifically hydrogen here, are going to play a key role in meeting those regulations over the long term.
That's great. Thanks, Luke. Our regular listeners will know that David and I are both regulatory geeks, and so it's hard to really let you get away with just that surface explanation on the regulations. I think thinking about regulatory schemes, regulations can sometimes be seen as holding back innovation, but in other circumstances, we can sometimes see regulation really pushing industries in a new direction. So maybe just to build a little bit on what you were starting to explain, can you talk about what the current state of play is with regulation in the maritime sector, both domestically in the United States and internationally?
Absolutely. I consider myself a regulatory geek as well. So
Good. We knew we liked you, Luke.
So the maritime industry, Sandi, as you alluded to, is subject to both international and domestic regulations. So let's start at the international level first. As I mentioned, those regulations are developed at the International Maritime Organization, or the IMO. All countries around the world are represented at the IMO, and the organization essentially develops these regulations on a consensus-based approach for all the member states that are present. And the IMO is represented by all countries around the world, so it really is a consensus body. These regulations are enforced ultimately by countries where the vessel is registered, also known as the flag state, and by port states where the vessels come to deliver or export goods from. One of the treaties that the IMO administers regulates the pollution in all forms from ships, including ship emissions. This is known as the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, or MARPOL, as it's commonly known in the industry. And Annex 6 of that convention regulates ship emissions. In the last 15 or 20 years, numerous regulations have come online that with a primary focus towards the reduction of SOx emissions and NOx emissions from the vessels. More recently, additional regulations have been developed at the international level with a focus on vessel efficiency and the reduction of carbon intensity, all of which is designed to meet IMO's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. Those goals are set forth in a strategy that the IMO has developed. The current target is to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions in international shipping by 50% by 2050. And the complete elimination of greenhouse gas emissions from the industry this century. Right now, there's a global debate going on whether the IMO's goals are aggressive enough, and that'll play out. And so the IMO's targets are subject to potential change in the future, with those efficiency and carbon reduction regulations possibly being tightened further. But regardless of how that debate turns out, those current regulations and additional regulations that are going to be developed will ultimately require vessel owners and operators to adopt alternative fuels, including among them potentially hydrogen. So that's the international scheme. As far as the domestic regulation is concerned, generally speaking, the U.S. is a party to MARPOL, and the United States usually attempts to align its domestic regulations very neatly with the international scheme. That might not necessarily be possible here. The IMO regulations do not apply to all vessels. For example, vessels that are of a certain size or a certain type, or vessels that only operate domestically, are not necessarily covered by these regulations explicitly. Thus, U.S. regulations yet to be developed will likely need to be implemented to fill in gaps to address carbon intensity and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from these vessels. So, in some sense, the IMO or the international scheme is somewhat incomplete. This has created a lot of uncertainty and regulatory risk, particularly for domestic vessel owners and operators going forward. That's the overall landscape.
Thanks, Luke. That's really interesting. I mean, I think as we've talked about in prior episodes, and you touched on also the benefits of converting to hydrogen as a fuel source for the transportation sector, particularly from an emissions perspective, are clear. And you touched on some of the areas of uncertainty with both the IMO and with domestic U.S. vessels that are not subject to MARPOL. But I'd be curious what some of the challenges are that you see to the broad development in the maritime sector of hydrogen as a fuel source.
Absolutely. So there are a number of challenges, Sandi. If you think of a vessel, it's quite different than a land-based consumer of hydrogen in that there's a limited amount of space and the vessels depart port and could be gone for weeks at a time. And so that the challenges that are involved with hydrogen on vessels really emanates from that distinction. I think most in the technical community will tell you that it is feasible to use hydrogen on board ships for power and propulsion, whether that's a hydrogen fuel cell or by using hydrogen adapted to combustion engines. That's pretty clear. And in fact, it's been done recently, which I think we might get into later. But there are practical and operational challenges currently that exist, including a lack of liquefied hydrogen available at scale to fuel the ships, the current high cost of green hydrogen compared to conventional fuels, a lack of adequate infrastructure in place to fuel the ships. These things all together create some challenges for the industry. If you think about it, in the 19th and 20th centuries, vessels have essentially been operating on fossil fuels, primarily diesel and heavy fuel oil, and suddenly we're about to change that system that's been in place for so long. A significant concern with hydrogen in the maritime sector is that even in its liquid form, it is less energy dense than bunker fuel. I'm sure your listeners know this well. And that tends to accentuate the problem of space availability on a ship and having to reduce the amount of cargo on board. And so there is an economical and space constraint that is of some concern. However, there is consensus in the maritime industry that hydrogen will be a clear, better alternative for short sea and inland shipping. That is shipping by vessels that operate on short voyages, non-transoceanic voyages. All of these challenges are likely or may well likely be overcome with time, including challenges associated with using hydrogen in an international large-scale shipping fleet.
So that kind of list of challenges is really interesting, particularly the infrastructure point. I mean, you talked, Luke, about, the history of fossil fuels, and a carrier can pull into any port in the world, a VLCC can pull into any port in the world, and they can get their fuel, right? And that doesn't exist. So I think that's a really interesting issue that the industry is going to have to face. So I guess kind of given the regulatory structure that you've talked about, the kind of international layer of the onion, if you will, the IMO, the domestic regulatory structure, as well as the challenges you just talked about, which are quite practical challenges. I mean, they're not kind of theoretical. They are very real, tangible challenges. Is it feasible? Is it reasonable, I suppose, to think that we'll actually see hydrogen-powered ships in the near term? 3 years, 5 years, whatever that is. I guess, practically speaking, what does a company need to do in order to move forward, or an investor, for example? There's obviously a lot of private equity and investment banks that are looking at this sector. What do they need to do in order to move forward with the hydrogen powered ship?
Well, David, to answer to your first question, I think we will in fact see more and more hydrogen fueled vessels being designed and built over the next 3 to 5 years. But I say that with a few caveats. Those vessels that will likely be built, hydrogen-powered vessels that will be built in the near term, will likely be smaller in size for either the passenger vessel market or small-scale short sea type shipping. But it is unlikely we'll see hydrogen-powered vessels operating in traditional international trade in 3 to 5 years. But I would say in 10 to 15 years, I think we probably will see that. So it's a longer-term proposition in the maritime sector. There are no specific regulations addressing the use of hydrogen as a marine fuel, and many view that as a sort of an impediment to progress and the development of hydrogen-powered fueled vessels. But in the United States, there is actually a regulatory and administrative process in place to obtain approval for novel designs like this. And so there is a regulatory and administrative structure in place. There's a track record for doing so here. Our firm has been involved in some of these projects. The use of LNG as a marine fuel, for example, was one area where we can learn a lot from in terms of how do you bring a vessel to design, to construction, to operation in a regulatory compliant manner. And so the hydrogen-powered vessels will generally require additional advanced dialogue, regulatory scoping, and review with the Coast Guard and possibly other agencies. So really advanced planning is the most important feature here. But there is an established process. What will be required? What will they look at? What will they apply? Well, in general, a vessel owner or designer will need to prove to the Coast Guard and other regulators that the hydrogen-powered vessel design essentially provides an equivalent level of safety and reliability to that which is required under existing regulations. So, for example, a cargo vessel that is going to be powered by hydrogen will generally need to satisfy the regulators that the hydrogen-powered cargo vessel satisfies from an equivalency standpoint, the level of safety that's provided for in those regulations.
That's really interesting, and I think sound advice, obviously, to folks interested in the sector in terms of advanced planning and importantly, dialogue with agencies. I mean, I think too often project developers, infrastructure developers think, we'll file our application and that's enough. But it is that dialogue that can be incredibly helpful. So I guess maybe kind of round this out, Luke, in light of the processes you just talked about and that there is a track record. Can you talk about significant developments that are underway, either in the United States or globally, in terms of either the conversion of vessels to hydrogen or perhaps new builds? What's going on right now? What are some of the exciting developments?
Sure, absolutely. So yes, there are several developments in this area, David. Hydrogen-powered vessels have been piloted in several countries in Europe and now actually in the United States. These are primarily smaller ferries and small-scale transportation of goods over water. One project that has received some attention recently is a project out on the West Coast. It's a zero-emission ferry powered by a hydrogen fuel cell. This is a 70-foot passenger ferry. It'll be able to carry 84 passengers, and its fuel cell should be able to fuel the vessel or power the vessel for 2 days of operations without refueling, which is fairly significant.
That's amazing. Yeah,
it is. And this vessel is supposed to operate in San Francisco. It is the first hydrogen fuel cell vessel in the United States and the first commercial fuel cell ferry in the world. Wow. And it was just recently launched, and it's currently undergoing its sea trials, I believe. It will eventually enter into service. It will be a commercial U.S. Coast Guard inspected passenger vessels carrying passengers for hire, which is really amazing, exciting, considering 10 years ago, nobody would even envision such a thing.
Yep.
In terms of conversion, vessels generally have a service life of 20 or 30 years and sometimes more. So the question of retrofitting existing vessels is a key question on the minds of vessel owners. In one promising study that recently was published, the study concluded that retrofitting the vessels may be a viable option for a very large segment, just over 40% of existing vessels operating in international shipping.
Wow.
And so the prospects of conversion are real. It's going to take time. The current administration overall is clearly focused on GHG emission reductions, as your listeners know very well, but including specifically at doing so in the maritime sector. Congress is likewise focused. There's recent legislation is riddled with opportunities and challenges for the industry. And just a plug here, that alone could be another podcast in and of itself. So
perfect. We love that.
But to make hydrogen feasible in the maritime industry as a viable alternative marine fuel at scale is going to require continued collaboration with policymakers and the maritime industry. And the maritime industry has a long history of dealing with complex problems. I will say the pace of regulatory change for our maritime industry in this area has never been greater. And so it's going to take a lot of collaboration and a lot of hard work by many in the industry and within government.
So your final statement there about the pace of change, I mean, that is a recurring theme that Sandi and I have talked about on the podcast, and not just in terms of regulatory change, but commercial changes and operational changes, technological. I don't know that I've ever seen something move as quickly as hydrogen has into the mainstream in my 20 years of practicing. So I think you're wise to point that out. This has been a fantastic conversation, Luke. We're really grateful to you for starting off this conversation on the maritime industry and its intersection with hydrogen. There's obviously a lot of issues to tackle here, and we'll be bringing in other guests over the coming months to continue this discussion. And, quite frankly, the maritime industry is really one of 2 or 3 industries in the world that have the potential to play an outsized role in decarbonizing the planet. So I think this is timely and very important. So with that, we'll close up today's episode. Thanks to all of our listeners for joining us today. Thanks to you, Sandi, for joining me again in the booth. If you like what you hear on Hydrogen Rising, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And of course, if you're so inclined, give us 5 stars in your podcast app. And if you have any questions about the maritime issues that we discussed today, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to Sandi, or specifically to our guest, my K&L partner, Luke Reid. You can find him on our website at www.klgates.com. And of course, stay tuned for the next episode of Hydrogen Rising in 2 weeks. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes, and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.